The movie opens up with a scene of a woman standing alone in steaming water surrounded by snow, ice, and lifeless trees. A male voice narrates, describing the scene, and ends with describing the woman's skin as something but doesn't finish the sentence. In the next scene, we see the man who is narrating the story. He is young, likely younger than 40, and is a military man. He states that he was given leave from the army and that this is when he first saw Helene. The two quickly fall in love, though the young man named Hervé has to leave her soon as he has a military career to pursue. However, Hervé cannot stop thinking about her, even when he's at home with his family. Elsewhere, a man named Baldebleu is meeting with Mayor Joncourt, informing him that he intends to open the silk mill. Joncourt laughs at the suggestion, asking Baldebleu where he hopes to get the money to take on such a venture. Baldebleu assures the mayor that he'll get the money to do this one way or another. All he requires of him is that he makes sure no one gets in his way. Hervé narrates that Baldebleu repaired the old mill within 6 months, and by the time he returned from the army, he had built 2 more. Baldebleu's efforts were successful, as Hervé narrates that the town soon saw more money than it had ever seen, thanks to this venture. Meanwhile, since returning from the army, Hervé and Helene are spending more time together than ever before. While lying on her lap in a garden, Hervé asks Helene to marry him, though he receives no answer. Later he meets with Baldebleu, who has specifically requested to meet him. Baldebleu says he needs a clever young man and thinks Hervé would be perfect for the task he has for him. He informs Hervé that the silkworms in Europe are dying from some disease, and he needs him to retrieve some healthy silkworm eggs from Africa, or the town's economy will suffer. Hervé apologizes and replies that he cannot go to Africa as he has to return to the barracks in 2 days. Baldebleu asks him who has requested that, and Hervé informs him that his father, the mayor, ordered that. Baldebleu scoffs and reassures Hervé that he will take care of that issue. Hervé narrates that Baldebleu was true to his promise. 2 weeks later, he was able to give up the uniform. He and Helene also got married, and suddenly Hervé was starting his new life. Some time passes, and Hervé and Helene are enjoying their life as a newly married couple, though Hervé admits that married life isn't as easy as he expected. He goes to see his wife at a school where she works, and informs her that he may be gone for several weeks or months, as Baldebleu wants him to go to Africa for him. Helene kisses her husband on the forehead and asks him to come back in weeks rather than months. Soon after, Hervé sets off on his quest to retrieve the healthy silkworm eggs. He reveals that his destination is Egypt, and that it took him a month to get there, and a little less to get back. Once the eggs were obtained, Hervé took special care of them by keeping them out of the heat and cleaning them daily, and getting back before they hatched. However, despite Hervé's articulate care of the eggs, Baldebleu informs him that some of the eggs are lifeless. The silkworm disease that has spread across Europe, the pebrine, had also infected the silkworm eggs retrieved from Egypt. Although Baldebleu had a plan, this involved making another, even longer journey to Japan. Baldebleu informs his newly married worker that he will be going there, and that Japanese silk is the best in the world, so he must have their silkworm eggs if his business and by extension the town's economy are to survive. Later, Baldebleu is having a meeting with his most important investors and the mayor. He shares his plan with them of having Hervé journey to Japan to purchase silkworm eggs, a land that the English nor the Chinese can't enter. The investors are interested in how much he is planning to spend on these eggs, and Baldebleu states that at best it will cost them 10,000 francs, and at worst, Hervé's life. That evening, Hervé is at home speaking to Helene about his trip. He has concluded that he cannot go, especially because he'll have to leave his wife for such a long time. However, Helene encourages him to go, because she'd rather have him traveling than going off to fight a war where he'd be more likely to be slayed. Now that Hervé has the support of his wife, he eventually sets off for the end of the world. Over several weeks, we see Hervé journey across the border, through Europe and the icy plains of Russia. Hervé notes that he spent his Christmas apart from his wife, and all he could think about as he ate his Christmas dinner at Lake Baikal was Helene. 11 days later, Hervé finally meets with his Japanese guide, who hands him a disguise as they sail towards the land of Japan. Eventually, Hervé reaches the port of Sakata. Though Hervé's journey didn't end there, he was eventually escorted through the mountain ranges of Japan, where he was greeted by new guides and traveled for 3 days through the peaks. After 3 days, Hervé reaches his destination, though the welcome is as cold as the temperature. Once at the village, Hervé is shown his quarters, and he struggles to eat the food given to him as he does not know how to use chopsticks. That evening, he is confused by a woman singing in the distance. He goes to investigate, though is unable to make out where the sound is coming from. Hervé runs into tough luck the next day, as his Japanese hosts want a better price for selling their silkworm eggs. However, when Hervé tries to leave the village, he is stopped by the leader who asks him to return. Once back at the village, Hervé is guided into the home of Baron Jubei, where he meets a beautiful woman wearing an all-white kimono, who slowly makes him tea while he stares at her in awe. Suddenly, a man comes up behind him and throws him some coins, which takes Hervé by surprise. The man is Baron Jubei, and he is suspicious of Hervé, asking who he is. However, when Hervé introduces himself as a merchant trader, this is insufficient for the Baron. Hervé assures him he is who he sees him to be. A man, born in a faraway country, who did everything to marry the woman he loves. Just then, the woman in a white kimono leans over and takes a sip from Hervé's cup, which catches his attention. The young woman is a concubine of Jubei's, who then points out that Hervé attempted to buy silkworms from him with fake gold. Hervé informs him that it is because he wants to get out of Japan alive, and promises he will have real gold as soon as Hervé leaves the country alive. This is acceptable to Jubei, and his concubine cannot stop staring at Hervé with interest. After a long, grueling journey back, Hervé finally makes it back home. Once at home, he attempts to surprise Aline, though she comes out before he can do so, and the couple embrace. A few days later, Hervé takes Helene to a field to surprise her. Helene is confused by this, but Hervé informs her that Baldebleu has already paid him his share, and that they are now wealthy enough to buy this plot of land and the home that comes with it. His wife is rendered speechless, almost unable to believe the words that are coming out of Hervé's mouth. Later, Hervé is playing pool with Baldebleu when the conversation turns to the topic of why the father of a mutual acquaintance of theirs packed his bags and left town forever. Baldebleu replies that he has no idea why he did such a thing, though this leaves Hervé thinking. That summer, the couple spend the entire summer renovating their new home, in which Hervé told Helene that they would grow old together in. One day, Hervé is sitting outside when Baldebleu comes to visit him. Hervé immediately knows what this visit means, that he may have to go back to Japan. However, Baldebleu gives Hervé a decision to make, as the journey may be even more dangerous this time. Hervé understands, but is confident that he can make it back, so is willing to go if Baldebleu wants this of him. Once again, Hervé bids farewell to his wife and sets out to Japan. He again crosses the frozen tundras of Russia and is guided through the mountains after the port of Sakata, blindfolded. Hervé narrates that he finally reached the village, but it was different this time, as he wasn't treated as a stranger now. This time he felt he belonged. Eventually, Hervé is permitted to meet with Baron Jubei again, and as soon as he arrives, he cannot stop staring at the fireplace where the beautiful concubine served him tea. A servant boy comes into the room and instructs Hervé to meet Jubei in the hot springs outside, where Jubei's concubine also happens to be. The Baron asks Hervé to join him in the hot spring, though Hervé quickly declines. Jubei then goes on to state that his father used to come here to watch the birds, as did his father, and his father before him. Hervé is confused by this, but Jubei states that now Hervé also seen the birds, meaning that he has now gained the Baron's trust. During the evening, Hervé is being bathed by some servant women while blindfolded. Before he can react, Jubei's concubine comes into the room and bathes him, and Hervé begins to feel even more relaxed. She hands him a note, written in Japanese, and immediately leaves. Afterwards, Hervé is trying to make out what it says on the note the concubine left him. Suddenly, he is surprised by a man who asks him about the contents of the note. The man introduces himself as Schuyler, and that he is Dutch. He reveals he is an arms dealer, and asks Hervé what his business is in Japan, and he reluctantly shares that he's here to buy silkworm eggs. Schuyler advises Hervé to not be fooled by Jubei's kindness, as even that costs something. Later that night, Hervé and Schuyler join the Baron and many of his trusted people for food. Schuyler notices Hervé staring at Jubei's concubine and asks him to be wary of her, as she isn't what she thinks she is. Hervé asks the Dutchman what he means by this, who reveals that the rumor is Jubei's concubine isn't Japanese at all. Before going to bed, Hervé comes back to his room to see that Jubei's concubine, as well as another woman, are waiting for him. He doesn't say anything, but then Jubei's concubine leaves the room and awaits outside, while the other woman disrobes and then helps Hervé disrobe too. The woman and Hervé spend an intimate night together, and at this point, Hervé isn't thinking about his wife. The next morning, Hervé goes to the hot springs, where he sees the concubine. It is revealed that the woman that Hervé is speaking of in the introductory scene of the movie is Jubei's concubine, who is a matter of intrigue for the young man. Jubei ends up leaving the village, taking his concubine with him. Hervé narrates that he got 4 boxes of silkworm eggs. However, when it was time for him to leave, he stayed an extra 2 days in the hopes that she would come back. Just as he is about to mount his horse, Hervé spots Schuyler's glasses in the snow, smashed in with Schuyler himself, nowhere to be seen. Eventually, Hervé arrives back home, and he meets Helene outside her school. His wife runs to embrace him, but there is guilt on Hervé's face as he spent the night with another woman. In the evening, the two of them are being intimate when Helene suddenly starts crying, as if she's in pain. Hervé immediately stops, asking her what's the matter, though she doesn't give a straight answer. Later that night, the couple are sitting together when Helene asks him about the Japanese woman who her husband has been talking about. Hervé reveals to his wife that the woman in question is not Japanese at all, but Chinese. Zhu Bei's concubine was the former wife of the Chinese emperor, and somehow, she ended up at the Japanese baron's side. The next day, Baldablue is doing what he usually does on any given day, playing pool, whilst Hervé is sitting in a corner in silence. Baldablue, bothered by this, asks his favorite worker why he looks so down. Hervé admits that he wants to ask Baldablue a favor. He wants to know if he knows someone that could translate a note for him, specifically the one that was given to him by Zhu Bei's concubine. Baldablue is hesitant, sensing that Hervé may be getting himself into a dangerous situation. However, after Hervé's assistance, Baldablue reveals that the owner of a brothel in Lyon, named Madame Blanche, will be able to help him as she is Japanese herself. Later that night, Hervé is in bed whilst Helene is lost in thought, washing her hands. He once again asks his wife what is troubling her, and she voices her concerns about having no child, despite the two of them trying for one for 2 years. Hervé reassures her that they just have to try harder, and that she shouldn't worry about it so much. Hervé wastes no time, and immediately sets off for Lyon, intending to meet with Madame Blanche, who is very selective with clients. Blanche assumes that Hervé is at the brothel to exchange money for sexual services, and is surprised when Hervé is prepared to pay for her in exchange for the translation of a note. She takes the note from Hervé, and quickly informs him that it simply states, "Come back, or I will perish." Hervé hands her the money, but Blanche advises him not to go back, as she doesn't believe that the woman who wrote the note will perish in any case. Sometime in the near future, Hervé is in Baldablue's office, who informs him that he knows a merchant who has recently brought back silkworm eggs from China, completely healthy, from the first down to the very last. Hervé immediately knows what this means, that his boss is trying to keep him from returning to Japan. He reiterates his desire to return to Japan and even states that he is willing to return with his own money if Baldablue doesn't permit him. Baldablue once again tries to convince him that Japan is too dangerous as of now, as the French have taken action and the land is in pure chaos. However, Hervé is adamant, and eventually Baldablue is also on his side, even arguing his case against Hervé's father. Although Baldablue secretly meets with Helene, assumingly hoping that she may be able to talk her husband out of this next trip to Japan. However, Helene isn't too keen to stop her husband, knowing how adamant he is to go. She informs Baldablue that all she can do is give him a reason to return. Hervé reassures his wife that he will be fine, and sets out to Japan, one last time. He goes through the same torturous journey that he has experienced twice before, only to arrive to Zhu Bei's village and see it destroyed. Hervé walks through the destroyed homes and buildings, hoping to find someone, but to no avail. Finally, he reaches the destroyed home of the Baron, leaning down near the fireplace, which is still intact. Just then, he is startled by someone approaching the entrance, which prompts him to quickly draw his firearm. To his delight, the person in question is the servant boy, who works for Baron Zhu Bei. Hervé questions him on the whereabouts of the village people, to which the boy draws a map and some dart. The servant boy informs Hervé that Zhu Bei and the people have journeyed to the foot of the mountain, and they are around halfway to their destination. The servant boy goes with Hervé on horseback to point out the location of his master and the villagers. After some time, both Hervé and the servant boy catch up to Zhu Bei's party, and Hervé is pleased to see that every one of them made it out alive. The servant boy then bids his farewell to Hervé, but he quickly tops him. Hervé hands the servant boy his telescope, as thanks for his help, which puts a smile on the boy's face as he takes his leave. Zhu Bei is informed by one of his men that his party has been followed by an outsider, which prompts the Baron to break away from the rest and see the stranger for himself. The Baron is infuriated when he realizes that the outsider is Hervé. He instructs him to take his gold and leave immediately, as he no longer has any business with him or the village. However, Hervé is upset by this, determined for Zhu Bei to let him stay. That evening, Hervé follows the party and sets up camp near their campsite. The next morning, Hervé is woken up by the party making a move, and he is about to follow them, but just then, he sees the servant boy's corpse from a tree. Hervé is devastated, falling to his knees as he realizes the consequences of his actions. The passing of this innocent boy is on his hands. Blood is on his hands. Just then, Jubei approaches him, armed with a rifle, and puts it right against Hervé's head. The Baron states that Japan is an ancient country with ancient laws, and that it is acceptable to condemn a man to demise for certain crimes. Hervé is now furious and even tries to swat away the Baron's rifle with his hand. Jubei once again instructs Hervé to leave, and this time, never to come again. This ends Hervé's journey for good, as he sets back to the port of Sakata. Once at Sakata, he acquires 4 boxes of silkworm eggs. This at least makes it, so his journey isn't a total waste. By the time Hervé arrives back in Europe, it is already summer. However, the eggs had all hatched and the worms were deceased, none left alive. Hervé finally arrives home, the exhaustion of his journey visible on his face. Hélène is standing outside as the carriage arrives, and when Hervé gets off, she is upset, admitting that she believed he was deceased, as he took much longer than usual this time. Hervé doesn't say anything. He only hangs his head in disappointment. Baldeblue suffered greatly from Hervé's recent failure, as he had to close 3 mills due to the lack of silkworms, which by extension, the village suffered. Hervé narrates that Baldeblue was kind enough to make up stories and excuses for his failure, but he himself sank into silence, unable to speak to anyone, even his wife. Sitting on a bench, alone, silent, Hervé no longer seems himself. Baldeblue comes to see his worker and friend, and asks him why he hasn't spoken to anyone, though he gets no reply. He then asks his friend what happened in Japan that has made him go into this mental state, but Hervé is assertive that he has nothing more to say, even though Baldeblue dismisses that as rubbish. Baldeblue informs Hervé that if this continues, everyone in the village will starve, so he asks him if he has any ideas on how to resolve this issue. Hervé again replies with silence, and Baldeblue has finally had enough, storming off. Just then, Hervé stops him by calling out his name. Hervé states that they'll build Hélène's garden, and that he will be in charge of hiring the people they need. Soon after, the entire town starts work on Hélène's garden. The goal is to use the fertile land that Hervé has recently purchased to grow crops so that they don't starve. It isn't too long before the work is complete, and Hervé finally is out of his depression. One night, Hervé is surprised to see that he has once again received a letter from Japan. However, before he can open it, Hélène comes into the room asking him to come to bed. The next day, Hervé wastes no time and ventures to Lyon to have the letter translated by Madame Blanche. Once there, Blanche agrees to translate the note, but on one condition, that he never go back to Japan again. Hervé reluctantly accepts her terms. Blanche reads out the letter, which very much reads out as an intimate love letter from Jubei's concubine to him. She bids him farewell, but also professes her love for him. After this, Blanche leaves the room, but Hervé is left silent, placing his hand on the letter as if to touch the woman he may never likely see again, but so desperately wanted to save. Some time passes, and Hervé narrates that France and the leaders of Japan sign a treaty of no aggression and for the trade of silkworms. Several months later, the Suez Canal opens, which made the journey to Japan just 20 days, and even less to come back. Meanwhile, Hélène and Hervé enjoyed their married life. The couple traveled the world and tried to accept that they would never have a child, which Hervé states brought peace to their lives. However, this peace didn't last long, as Hélène became very ill. As time went on, Hélène became weaker and weaker. Hervé was losing patience with the doctors, who informed him that his wife needed to rest, but he was adamant that was all she was doing, and not getting any better. Eventually, it got to the stage where Hélène couldn't walk without a walking stick, and she had even accepted the fact that she did not have long left, though she was still worried about leaving her husband all alone. One rainy day, Hervé goes to Hélène's bedside and wipes her head and face with a wet cloth, as she is now unable to do most things without assistance. He then grabs her hand and falls to his knees, with a sad expression on his face. He admits to Hélène that there are things that he has hidden from her. Hélène stops him, assuring her husband that it is fine. She strokes his head and asks him if he remembers the first time he showed her their new home, and states it is where the two of them will grow old together. Hervé then begins sobbing uncontrollably, after Hélène asks him if they're old now, realizing that maybe by constantly traveling to faraway nations, he lost precious time with his wife. Hervé narrates that Hélène passed away in April of that year, just before her lilies bloomed. Hélène was buried in the garden that Hervé built for her, leaving her husband broken. Meanwhile, Baldeblue closed down his mills, took one suitcase, and left for good. In his last conversation with Hervé, he states that he once knew a man who built his own railroad, and that he built it completely straight. However, he doesn't recall why he built it straight, as reasons are forgotten, but actions remain. After that, Hervé states that he eventually found something to send him on a new journey, though this wasn't as far as the last one. He goes to Lyon to visit Madame Blanche again, but is informed that she has moved to Paris and that her previous brothel doesn't have her address. However, much to Blanche's displeasure, Hervé is able to eventually track her down. He responds that he did so by trial and error, by knocking on every door in Paris. Hervé questions Blanche if she wrote the letter that he believed was from Jubei's concubine, though Blanche reveals that she did not. Surprisingly, Blanche reveals that the person who actually wrote that letter was Hélène. Hervé is shocked, as he had no idea that his wife knew of his almost affair with the Baron's concubine in Japan. Hélène wrote those words in the hope her husband would forget about the woman and forgive himself for not being able to save her and the servant boy. Blanche states that Hélène wanted to be the woman that her husband was enchanted by, but Hervé interrupts her, stating that she was that woman. With tears in his eyes, he bids Blanche farewell. Hervé arrives back home and is surprised to see Ludovic, the neighbor boy, working in the garden on a weekend. He asks the boy to sit on the bench with him, and the two reminisce over the good times spent with Hélène in the garden. Ludovic apologizes, as he notices the sadness on Hervé's face, though he asks the boy not to apologize. He now remembers his wife in the water, instead of being fixated on the image of Jubei's concubine. Hervé sends Ludovic home, as he is still lost on though sitting on the bench. The movie closes with Hélène narrating the letter, the last words she left for her husband.